Okay, I think we'll get started. Welcome, everyone, to the Wilson Center. Welcome to this afternoon session of the Washington History Seminar. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the History and Public Policy program here at the Wilson Center, and it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome all of you, as well as today's featured speaker, Professor Robert Jervis, one of the real greats in our profession. So I'm really excited about today's talk. Moderating today's session will be Eric Arneson of George Washington University. Professor Arneson, my co-chair here, who also represents the other organization involved in this program, the National History Center. The Washington History Seminar is a joint venture of the National History Center and the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program. We'd like to welcome all of those who are watching us live through the webcast and suggest that you visit the Woodrow Wilson Center website to learn more about the seminar series and upcoming speakers. Let me thank our donors that allow us to do this series, the LePage Center for History and the Public Interest at Villanova University, as well as George Washington University's History Department. They provide financial support, as do a number of anonymous donors. I know there some of you are in the audience, and we, of course, continue to welcome contributions from any of you. This is really a shoestring sort of pro bono operation that we run here every Monday at 4 p.m., the Washington History Seminar, bringing both preeminent and emerging historians and historically working scholars to a Washington audience. Behind the scenes, there are a couple of individuals I should thank for their work to make this event possible. Jeff Rieger, the Assistant Director of the National History Center. Jeff, where are you? There you are, all the way in the back. And Peter Bierstecker on my team, my colleague on my team, as well as our intern, Si-Yeon Kim, who will be helping with the microphones during the Q&A. Before we begin, let me ask that you turn off or turn to silence your mobile devices so we are not being disturbed in the intense and fun discussions that I think we'll have this afternoon. And now I'll turn it over to my co-chair, Professor Eric Arneson, to introduce today's featured speaker. Welcome.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you to all of you who have come out on what is actually a nice spring Thursday afternoon. We very much appreciate your joining us for what I anticipate will be a truly terrific session this afternoon. Robert Jervis is the Adlai E. Stevenson Professor of International Politics at Columbia University and one of the country's leading political scientists whose work frequently employs history. Among his many books are Why Intelligence Fails, Lessons from the Iranian Revolution and the Iraq War, American Foreign Policy in a New Era, The Meaning of the Nuclear Revolution, and his Perception and Misperception in International Politics, the second edition of which was published in 2017, and it's a true classic that has influenced generations of scholars. He serves on the board of 9 scholarly journals and has authored over 100 publications. He served as president of the American Political Science Association in the years 2000-2001 and has been awarded honorary degrees by the universities of Venice and Oberlin College. In 2004, he received the Lasswell Award for Lifetime Achievement by the International Society of Political Psychology. 2 years later, he was awarded the National Academy of Sciences Triannual Prize for Behavioral Science Contributions to Avoiding Nuclear War. Professor Jervis has chaired the CIA's Historical Review Panel, which advises the Central Intelligence Agency on systematic and automatic declassification review. And this afternoon, he will be speaking on a new book, How Statesmen Think, The Psychology of International Politics. Professor Jervis.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you all for coming out on what is the first, at least for me, a nice day we've had. And it's a great pleasure to talk to people, some of you who are historians, people interested in history, as some of you who are academics or know that world. There's what I like to think of friendly rivalry and disagreements among history and political scientists, because we do things somewhat differently, but we do many of the same things. And my own work, both teaching and research is enormously indebted to the work of my colleagues in history, and particularly to some of the work done at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and especially the work on the Cold War and the declassification of documents. In fact, I want to take, I hope, no more than 5 minutes to digress about declassification, because they're actually, first, to understand recent history and the history of the Cold War, we all depend to a significant degree on declassified documents, American above all, but of course not only, Soviet and then Russian, Chinese, other countries, and say Christian and others done an enormous job pulling much of that together, and as our colleagues also at the National Security Archive have. And that just changed our views of many things in the Cold War. It truly is indispensable. And now, that's been a difficult process, both for reasons of bureaucracy and because I think they're very legitimate secrets, especially, or not only, but especially sources and methods and relations with foreign allies that have to be protected. So although I want to see as much out as possible, that often I think it's legitimate to keep things secret even 50, 60 years. But I think we're now facing what really is a crisis in the declassification system. And it's emerged in the last year or two, but it is not attributable to Trump. That's the surprise. It's the good news and the bad news. The contours of this are not entirely clear because it's different agency to agency. Make a long story short, the Defense Department for years has been difficult, and now it's impossible. Those of you who worked there, not totally surprised, but deeply disturbing, because this is a very important element in the Cold War. The Department of Energy is hiding behind the Kyle-Lott Amendment, which was designed to inhibit terrorists from learning about how to make bombs, and that's been used as an excuse to keep things like the number of Minuteman silos secret, right? Terrorists, that's really going to help them get a bomb. The presidential libraries, which are absolute sort of the beating heart of that, because it has the best documents, have, for a variety of reasons, stopped doing systematic declassification and are relying on FOIA and MDR. I'll come back in a second. And CIA has stopped doing systematic, that is, bulk declassification, also largely due to resource constraints, I believe. So you might think, well, we have FOIA and MDR. We do, but they're no good because the systems are broken. They're incredibly overloaded. FOIA has a number of structural problems, we could talk about later. Let me not go into. MDR was built for a very small number of documents. So the system isn't working, and at present, there are no measures I know of to break the logjam. It's going to mean we will not understand the areas, the late 70s, the 1980s, the end of the Cold War, let alone the post-Cold War, unless people with more power than I have, and there are a lot of them, especially, I hope, journalists and Congress, get in the act and both put pressure and do some basic changes. Otherwise, we are going to grind to a halt for so much of the new material we depend on. All right. Those of you who are in Schaefer may have seen or may see in the issue of Passport that just came, I have a piece on the particular CIA aspects, which are unfortunate, but I want to stress what's more important is the general crisis. All right. hope to cover 4 general topics. So with my eye on the clock, I'll stop by 4:50 or a little before. And the first is sort of general remarks about the topics of beliefs and perceptions and their importance in studying history and international politics. Then talk about the common perceptual errors that we think occur, and the sources of evidence being, for me, diplomatic history and a lot of the theory from psychology, which is now infused in a lot of our general knowledge, and do it under 2 categories, purely cognitive and things that are more motivated, more affective. Then briefly talk about things related to personalities, and also briefly then turn to the implications for the disciplines of studying history, political science, and policy. So let me start. And that partly studying beliefs is in a way should be more second nature to historians and political scientists, and without going into inside baseball in the 2 disciplines, the point is, at least as I understand it, a lot of what historians are doing, at least at the first cut, is trying to get inside the shoes of the people, partly decision makers, but also other people involved, recreating to change the part of the body we're talking about, to see the world through their eyes, because we're talking about recreating the subjective worlds in which people operated, often in the distant past, when we can no longer even ask them, or in the years when we can ask them, but we can't trust what they say and want to match it with what they wrote at the time and that. And, of course, we don't want to stop there. We also want, and this is what political scientists tend to do more self-consciously than historians, but historians do it, and I think lay people do it as well. We want to think about both the causes and the effects of beliefs, and we want to be quite careful here for reasons that I'll come to when I talk about the role of what we call motivated biases and emotions. The status of beliefs as a topic to be studied and as a factor that explains behavior really is deeply contested, not only among academic theories, but as usual, I think you can find these in lay views of the world as well. One, to oversimplify, as usual, the one view sees them as quite autonomous. They have to be explored in themselves, and tracing the roots is difficult and often idiosyncratic, and I'll come to something. But there's another view which is really quite important, more in Europe than the U.S., but still here, and a much more materialist, and was stated, I should have brought the exact quote, but in a famous quotation from Karl Marx about the ideas that rule are the ideas of the ruling class, that the fundamental beliefs that we hold, and often that run very deeply, we don't even sometimes articulate them because they're just shared, are formed by the basic structure of the society we're in, and that in turn is rooted in what the Marxists called the economic structure. And the ideas, in a sense, ride on that, are superstructure. You don't have to be a Marxist to adopt that basic view as a decent starting point. I don't adopt it, but I think it's something, we should take seriously, that our ideas don't come out of nowhere, and they are deeply rooted in the way we're socialized from by our parents, by the media, by our schooling, by our interactions with peers. And I try to startle my students, if I can get their attention, by reminding them that if they had lived, say, a slightly more than 100 years ago, all of them would think that there were very powerful racial and gender hierarchies, that colonialism was not only the right of the major powers, but the duty to bring civilization to indigenous people, and that this was something that they, as university students, would clearly have believed because they all did over 100 years ago. And so and then we can explain partly imperialism in various ways, not only Marxist, but its role in the international system. So I think we do want to take that seriously. On the other hand, I think there is indeed more to it than that. And the view that sees beliefs as called generally functional, that is just riding on the back of material interests, I think just misses too much. That said, I think when we look at beliefs and their roles here, and I'm not defining beliefs very rigorously, we can come to that, but generally the normative beliefs we have, what we think is valued, what goals we think are seeking, and our means-ends relationship, how we think we're going to get there, and in international politics, not only the rules of the international game, but what we think about specific other countries, images we hold of other countries, particularly whether they're allies or adversaries, whether they can be conciliated or not, things like that. This implies, and I think correctly, but debatably, a fair amount of freedom of really free will or agency. That is, that individuals, though, do have both some choice in what they're going to believe, and those choices are consequential. I think we clearly see that in decision makers. They are not just moved by invisible forces. We see consequential choices, for better or worse, made all the time. Some of you here either are in the government or other things and making them or have made them. And although people in power sometimes exaggerate the importance of the decisions, in that maybe the world wouldn't have been so different had the decisions been different, I think we can talk in many ways in which decisions rooted in particular identifiable beliefs really do affect the course of history. They arise, I think, in some ways, some individual, and I'll come back in the third general topic, talk a little bit about idiosyncrasies, and certainly cultural, that there are often shared perceptions and intellectual tools and assumptions that are taken for granted and that are hard for us to excavate because, it's just in our atmosphere. There's a famous and excellent article by a British historian, James Joel, on the unspoken assumptions behind British foreign policy in the years leading up to World War I. Things like social Darwinism, the belief that war, although terribly costly, was in some sense good for societies, that it was inevitable at some point, and several other assumptions that probably people were not totally unaware. If you could go back and interrogate them, you could pull it out of them, but you'd have to pull it out because they just regard it as self-evident, and that these are important and need to be studied. But these often are not shared across countries and across cultures. And let me say it this way. I know when we study international politics, use analogies. One obvious analogy used all the time is chess. And this is a terrible analogy for international politics because first it has set rules. You're not allowed to kick over the chessboard. And more than that, and the pieces are out all in the open. So that's not very good. So poker is a much better analogy. There are rules, but we hold the cards, we hope, close to our vest. we try sometimes to have someone in back of our opponent who is signaling us what's in the other person's hands. And as a student of intelligence, we still do not have anything like a full accounting of what was known by each government of the other side's secrets. But it's a very, very long list. The Soviets had very good intelligence on us. We had some remarkably well-placed spies and good SIGINT on them. So we really need the full accounting. But anyway, they're trying that. And of course, you can lie and bluff. So that's better. It is better, but I don't think it catches it. My sense from looking at a large number of cases is the best analogy is the Japanese short story and movie Rashomon, which some of you, I hope, know. Remarkably few of my students know it, because it's a Kurosawa movie, which is just marvelous. The basic story, if those don't know it, set in medieval Japan. A nobleman, his wife, and the person who's pulling their rickshaw are set upon by a bandit. There's struggle, various unpleasant things happen. Then there's a trial of the bandit. And in the story, each person, including the nobleman who's dead, recite the story. And each person tells a wildly different story, including then there's someone hiding in the bushes who tells yet another story. Right? And I think a great deal of international politics is like Rashomon. Not to imply that each side is unified. That, any of you who've been in government, been in the dreaded interagency process, know what ninnies your colleagues in other agencies are and how they don't understand. But putting that aside, between governments, you see that in, say, the memory jogging conferences that the academic and policy communities had after the Cold War. We had a number on the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's a marvelous Carter-Brezhnev project. It's on the National Security Archive website. And my former colleague Bob Legvold ran one session, and so I got a lot of the local color from Bob as well as reading it. The Cold War's over. You get the people around the table. Many of them, really become personal friends. They've read documents from both sides. They sit around and they recreate the same arguments they had in the 1980s. And they say, in effect, what? How could you have seen that? You saw that, believed we were doing what? I mean, are you really telling me the truth? You just can't believe what the other side was saying. And clearly, both sides were at this point, they're not lying to each other. Some self-deception, but they were in different perceptual worlds. And I think this is more the rule than the exception. As a rigorous political scientist, I can't prove that. I'd need more careful data on more cases. And there's what we call a selection effect problem. When they're in different worlds, they're more apt to collide, and the collisions are more interesting than day-to-day when things run smoothly. So we, both historians, political scientists, lay people who just love history, as I hope you do, we know much more about the train wrecks than when things run smoothly. And things often do run smoothly, but I think this Rashomon phenomenon, at minimum, is not unusual. And I think remains underappreciated. I think it's unappreciated in the disciplines. I think it's very, very much unappreciated in Washington and every other capital. And that'll be the last thing, and I'll make sure I come back to it, even though I'm going to have to go more quickly on other things. Okay, now to be brief, capturing people's beliefs is very hard in the past, even with documents, because as we know, those of you who've written them, they're always written to persuade and often to deceive. That sometimes quite benignly, a student of mine, very good scholar, Karen Yarhi Milo, who I'm happy to say is joining the Columbia faculty in the fall from Princeton, that Columbia's we've stolen 2 of their best scholars. I wish we could steal their money, then we'd really be in good shape. But anyway, she one chapter in her book on threat perception. It is differing, and is threat perception in the Carter years of Soviet Union. She interviews Brzezinski. Some of you know, Spig wrote weekly memos for Carter. And she was interviewing him about him, and he said, Karen, you have to understand, I would never put things in these memos to the president I didn't believe. I great faith in him and trust. We disagreed often, but I have great personal respect, and of course he was president. But if there were 3 arguments I could advance, which I thought had some validity for a position that I believed in, I knew I thought one would appeal to him and 2 wouldn't. Let me tell you which one's going in the memo. So what you read in the memos are true to my beliefs in a sense. I mean, I'm never just doing deception, but they're an accurate picture of my beliefs about Carter's beliefs. They're not an accurate picture of how I arrived at the position, what evidence I was using, the full set of what I thought about things. We know the documents can be misleading. Thanks to Richard Nixon, we have, of course, an unparalleled asset in the tapes, the White House tapes. And one interesting question, which I'm getting some people to write on for the International Security Studies Forum, is what the study of the tapes tells us about our analyses of most of the rest of the periods when we don't have evidence like that. That is, if the tapes have changed our view of Nixon and the Nixon presidency, that should lead us to ask some questions or give us some suspicions about where we might be wrong in the analyses of other presidencies when we don't have that asset. Well, hard to do, but quite intriguing. It's also very hard to study beliefs when we find them wrong or repugnant. For wrong, my poster child is, I think, my colleagues in the history profession who study Vietnam have done us a disservice. And I've said that to their face. The definition of a good academic colleague is someone who will stab you in the chest. So I don't believe in saying things behind people's backs. So some of you, I hope you've had a presentation by Fred Logvell at some point. If not, I hope you will. It's marvelous. I've argued with Fred, not persuaded him, but that's because he's stubborn, that no, it isn't humiliation that drives Johnson in the war. It's belief in the domino theory. Fred can't believe that, and most historians can't, because they think the domino theory is patently wrong. Well, I think it's wrong, but not absurd. And so I can readily believe they believed it, and I can go far back in their history, various things, and I can't prove it. But, I think, yes, they did believe what they were saying. And I think when you think people are profoundly wrong, but they're not necessarily terrible people, that's very hard to do. It's even harder, of course, when the beliefs are really repugnant. How do we write the history of people who are racist? It's hard, and indeed it's, I'm glad to see you're still named the Wilson Center. And Wilson, we know, was really a racist and more than was necessary for his time. But we want to understand Wilson, right? We want to empathize it. Yes, we may make a judgment, a moral judgment. I have no problem with that. But we don't want the moral judgment to contaminate our understanding of him. But how do you do that? It's extremely difficult. Okay, and now I want to talk about some common errors. And in 2 categories. The first is cognitive, that is, the need to make sense of the world. And for here, the basic problem is the world is very, very complicated, and our brains are very limited. We can't be fully rational. It's simply impossible. That just a minor thing. Economists have recently discovered this. They've read the same psychology that I've drawn on for 50 years, but suddenly they've discovered it, and they now call it behavioral economics. It isn't. It's applied social and cognitive psychology, which I've taught to my freshmen for 50 years. So, but once Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, he did work with Amos Tversky. Amos couldn't get the Nobel Prize because he died unfortunately before given. Once they got the Nobel Prize in economics for it, then economists could do this, and they've sort of rediscovered that people are human. And there's a very funny, I think it's his Nobel Prize address by Richard Thaler that's quite good on this, talks about econs versus humans. And I love twitting economists. They get paid more than we do, so all I can do is twit them. But anyway, we know that it's simply impossible to do what a lot of economic theory assumes people can do. It far outruns our mental capabilities. So we need various shortcuts to rationality. Most of our cognitive processing is unconscious and subconscious. We are not aware of the influences on us. This is summed up in a nice book called Strangers to Ourselves by I think, Richard Wilson. May have the name slightly wrong. Anyway, and we can demonstrate this in experiments, which, by the way, makes real problems back for what I'm talking about beliefs and sources. Because if we talk to people, either just want to do the mass level or elites, about how they came to conclusions, what evidence influenced them, and they're completely honest with them, they may not know what influenced them. We can show ways we can influence people that they're unaware of. Some of this research is quite controversial. Some of it hasn't been replicated, all sorts of problems, but really, fundamentally, at least we can do this to some extent. Anyway, partly because of that, partly because people have to use shortcuts. What shortcuts do they use? Let me just mention 3. One, and they're all ones of simplifying. One is we perceive other actors, especially other countries, as much more centralized than they are. That we downplay the importance of accidents and malcoordination because that's very complicated. Supposedly, I think it was either Metternich or Talleyrand at the Congress of Vienna supposedly said when the Russian ambassador died, the apocryphal story is that he said, I wonder why he did that. Well, there are lots of cases of that. We over-explain because that makes for simpler stories, and we need stories to keep in our mind. Second, not unrelated to the need for stories, historical analogies. We reach for historical analogies, and furthermore, we tend to go for analogies to cases that mattered to us personally and our country, often ones we lived through firsthand, especially when we first came to political consciousness or first joined the political arena. But there's no logical reason those should be a better guide than any others. But they are psychologically much more readily available to us. Third, and more generally, we are all, to a significant extent, theory-driven rather than evidence-driven, although there's variation in individuals on this, but as a generalization, it's still quite a bit to it. That is, to understand the world, we have to oversimplify. So we see evidence of various types, and we have to get a conclusion or an analysis, a framework, an understanding. And we have to do it as quickly as we can. And many, by the way, the processes of the government magnify the need to be quick. If something's happening in the world and you're in one part of the government and this information is known, you know everyone else in the government is feeding their bosses what's happening in an interpretation. And you think, it would be better to sit on this. Just think about this for several days. Right? You can't do that. Your boss is going in a meeting in 2 hours. She's going to be sandbagged by someone else who has a good analysis on a piece of paper. You've got to do that. You don't have the time. when, and from the intelligence fails, when the U.S. government got the infamous tubes from Iraq that were on the way to Iraq in the summer of 2001, the CIA analyst himself and then the CIA as an organization jumped to the conclusion that these were for enrichment centrifuges. They jumped to that conclusion within, I think, 24 hours. If they had been able to study it carefully, call on experts, say, for a week, they might have reached the different and better conclusion, and it would have contributed to saving us a great deal of grief. But even leaving aside the organizational thing, there are individual psychological reasons to do this. Uncertainty is very uncomfortable. And once we have an idea, a conclusion, an image of the other, even if we've done it quickly, new evidence is assimilated to that. So we will be stubborn. We will hold that view longer than we would otherwise. And to put it another way, that our theories of the world and our expectations of what we will see in any interaction are a very strong driver of what we actually will see. Could do much more, I do in there. Let me now turn to the second category of what I think are general drivers of beliefs and perceptions. These are not so much cognitive, that is a need to oversimplify, as they are motivated. Motivated, we say, well, we always have motivation to understand the world. Yes, but when psychologists use the word motivated, and when I use it, we mean something different. We mean the role of emotions and affect, that we become very attached to some, not all of our beliefs. But say for those of us all in this room who are, attached to our political beliefs, they form part of our self-identities. I won't say they never change, but they change slowly. We care deeply about them, and part of the tenor of the partisan disagreements in Congress and, in our cocktail parties and everything are driven by the fact that our discussions of these issues are not only purely cognitive, but driven by our attachment, our emotions that come with this. A second aspect I want to take a little more time on, and what I have developed here, is we tend to try to avoid seeing painful value trade-offs because they are painful. If you look at arguments about almost anything, personal or political, whether go to war in Iraq, going back to the 50s and 60s, the test ban treaty, right now, policy toward Iran, North Korea, the broad disagreement between people who want to pull back from in foreign policy, so-called restrainers. They're not isolationists, I think, but more on that end of the spectrum, and people who want so-called deeper engagement, even selective engagement, let alone primacy. Look at those arguments in all those cases, and I can give you really more than you would want to hear, that almost all of them involve belief overkill. That is, people have multiple reasons for believing the same thing, and reasons that are not logically connected. Now, we all know choice is difficult, and etc., and there are a lot of books by political leaders on hard choices, but when you read their accounts, the choices aren't that hard, because in the end, when they come to a decision, everything points in one direction. In very few of the cases are there hard value trade-offs. Take the war in Iraq. Very few people thought that, on the one hand, for security reasons, it was necessary to overthrow Saddam, but that the occupation would be long, difficult, and destabilizing the Middle East. Nothing, right? It's not illogical to believe those two things. But no, almost no one did. No one made that trade-off. People who felt you had to invade also believed the occupation would be easy. those of us on the other side of the debate, the people who, to just give it a label, the people who were right, said that on the one hand, he wasn't a menace, although we did think he was getting WMD, but we thought he could be deterred. And on the other hand, we also thought that the occupation would be difficult. But these two dimensions are orthogonal. And yet, to make our typical fourfold table, there were very few people making trade-offs. There were very few people who said, we shouldn't go in, although he is a menace, because it's going to be worse that. Or very few people who said, we should go in because, or say, he isn't a menace, but this is a great opportunity. No. So we avoid psychologically these trade-offs because they are too painful. Partly leaders need a degree of real confidence. To sell the policy, you want to sell it on multiple grounds, and you're a most effective salesman when you believe it. And if you want a good night's sleep, you want to believe it, right? So this contributes also to overconfidence. It contributes to the clash between intelligence and policymakers, and I've got a chapter on that there. It contributes to the people being slow to think about a plan B to realize their policy is failing. And when they come to analyses of the other side, it makes empathy very hard because from the outside you can see that the other side seems to be heading off the cliff. But you realize, no, he's sensible. He's not going to go over the cliff. But he does because he doesn't see it the same way. One reason the U.S. was taken by surprise at Pearl Harbor, I'd say almost the primary reason, was that all the American decision makers knew that it was suicide for Japan to attack a country with a GDP 10 times what it had. It was clearly be destroyed if it attacked. Japanese leaders were fanatic, they were evil, but they weren't stupid and they weren't crazy, so they won't attack Pearl Harbor. They may attack the Philippines, but that might not draw us into war. So what do? They go ahead and attack Pearl Harbor. We couldn't understand the pressures they were under in this way. And I think there are a lot of surprise attack cases that have this. All right, I've got 3 more minutes. Let me skip the individual differences, roles of personality, roles of genes. There is some genetic component, I think, and idiosyncrasies, and just take literally a minute on the implications for the study of history, for study of political science, and more importantly, for the study, for the conduct of policy. That it's very important when we do histories to try to understand the beliefs that the people we're studying are acting on. And I think most historians do understand that, but I think the hurdles really are very great, especially, say, when we find the beliefs either strange, when we find them wrong, and when we find them repugnant. And often that is what we're going to find. So, but reconstructing that, what did they believe? How did they believe it? How did that fit with other things they thought? To what extent is it a reflection of personalities or not? How do we compare the beliefs of people who disagree, or even how people arrive at the same conclusions or were viewed in different ways? That's hard. And then when you're doing the history not of a country's foreign policy, but of the international politics, you have to look at both sides or all sides. And again, historians in the last 30 years or so have done a much better job of multi-archival research, but it's extraordinarily difficult. The linguistic demands and time and all that, it's very, very hard. But still, to really catch what's going on, you have to reconstruct what is usually the Rashomon, and that's an extraordinary challenge. For political science, I think the challenge is similar. A lot of theories in political science are built on oversimplified assumptions borrowed from economists, what's known as rational choice theory. I would not want to throw that out entirely. I've done some work of that that general spirit without the math myself, but one wants to be very careful that individuals, they do differ, and what they, you can generalize, but you both have to be alert to the exceptions, and you have to try to carve out decent categories of what people are going to believe when. And you have to often look carefully at the choices people are making rather than do things by assumption. Finally, implications for policy making and intelligence, I think, are still underappreciated. To be immodest, a lot of people in the intelligence community have read either this book or the Perception and Misperception, and they've absorbed a lot of the lessons of that and a lot of other research that I draw on that and that has occurred subsequently. But it's very hard to do. When you're analyzing the other side, it's often very hard to look at the other side's misperceptions and very hard to look at the way the other side can see your country, especially when the other side has a picture of your country that you think is wildly wrong or misleading. And it's even harder to write papers for policymakers that do that. As you know, we do lots of national intelligence estimates, NIEs. I've urged people in the IC to do more attempts at other sides' NIEs about the world and about us. Usually this meets with great resistance on two grounds. First, it's very, very hard, which it is, and the consumers are not likely to be happy campers. And that's probably, in many cases, that's probably right. You're sometimes going to tell them, we think the other side thinks that you're stupid or evil or weak or incompetent or some combination of those. As an academic, I can say, oh, of course you should write that and give it, to the Secretary of State or the President. Okay. So, that's why I think I've seen a couple of times. I've seen more of this work in the Pentagon than the IC, because the Pentagon has more clout and they can get away with it. But even the few papers I've seen, I only seen a few that I thought were pretty good on this. I don't think they had wide circulation. I don't think they went to the White House. I think they may have gone to State or the IC, but I think they were fairly closely held. I think every policy paper should have an annex or a column or something that says, okay, this is what we're doing, and this is how we think the other side, this is why we're doing it, this is the effect, this is how we think the other side or country A is going to see it. This is how we think, country Germany is going to understand this policy. This is how we think Russia is going to perceive it. Or even this is how different factions in these countries are going to interpret this. And then, can't be sure of that. What would we look for to see that our policy is having the effect that we want? What are we going to look for to see, oh yes, the Germans are perceiving it the way we think. Or yes, the Chinese are taking this policy the way we intend it rather than to misperceive it in 4 or 5 different ways. That's hard. I think it actually, is doable. This column of how they're going to perceive it is speculative. And I know in the policy world, speculation has a bad name, so you have to call it best estimate. Okay. Or learned something. You can name it whatever you can name it Trump Tower, anything. So I think it can be done. I don't mean to underestimate its difficulty. I think it would be very valuable, both for disciplining the analysts and the IC, to make explicit, I think, what they often have implicit. I think it would bring it to the attention of the decision maker, and sometimes the decision maker say, you think they're going to see it that way? You may know that country, But I've spent 10 hours sitting across the table from the foreign minister, and I think he's going to see it differently. Well, that's an important discussion to have, and this could trigger it. So I think, a lot of academic ideas are foolish. I think this is a good idea. I'm not sure it's at all practical, but I like to end with something that I actually think is a good idea. So let me stop with that.
All right. Thank you. So we're not around a table today since we have so many people in this auditorium. So you will bear with us with the rules. Please wait till we call upon you. We have to get the microphone to you. Please use the microphone so that everyone can hear. And if you could identify yourself before you offer your question, we'd very much appreciate it. So let me start off, Chair's prerogative, with a question across disciplinary line. I'm an historian. I'm not a political scientist. I don't do psychology of international politics. On several points in your talk, you talked about the difficulty of understanding the beliefs of people that you find repugnant, and that this is painful or difficult to do. When I think of fields that are not your fields, taking American history, I can think of many works that honestly grapple with and do not shy away from repugnant beliefs. There are studies of, biographies of, say, George Wallace, that very much aim at understanding the racial worldview that developed with Wallace and his compatriots over time. There are people who write about Pitchfork Ben Tillman, Southern racist and terrorist. Yes, or a very different character, Winston Churchill. And so many people writing about these figures do not share their worldviews in any form or fashion, and yet historians of areas not covered in your work would say, but that's precisely the challenge.
Yeah.
This is what we do, and we can do it wrong, but we really do aim to get it right.
Yes, I first, I agree completely, and I want to, certainly say many works do it well. It is very hard, and I think partly, in a way, it may be easier for someone like Wallace when we tend to be less conflicted, most of us. Although he did have an economic, liberal, or populist aspect that Tillman did too, that many people buy. Historians tend to be on the left, so that they would sympathize with most of them. But I think people who, when you really, in a way, totally dislike, I think in a sense it can be easier because you can put everything aside. I think it's the people and the periods of time when Wilson, perfect example, Lyndon Johnson, Vietnam, where the scholar or the layperson who's, when you're just reading about Johnson or Wilson trying to understand, I think that's hard because it's a mixture, that the person has got so many admirable characteristics, and then you have these others. I think it is a challenge, and yes, I agree, many very excellent historians rise to the challenge, but what I think I see when I read especially a number, not Fred, whose work I disagree with but think is marvelous, but a number of historians, especially in American foreign relations, in the post-Vietnam generations, a degree of moralizing. And how do you avoid what I consider the cheap moralizing? That, these people believed repugnant things. I'm much better than he is. We now are much better than they are. I think that's a trap that it's easy for us looking back to fall into, and it's easy for the historians to. And I don't want to sort of say they all fall into it, but I do think a lot of works of history do that. I mean, they feel it's their job to be critical, but I want, in many cases when I'm reading a book, to say, I want a better explanation. The moral judgment is the easier part, and sometimes I think it contaminates the understanding.
Thank you. All right, that was the first hand I saw, a gentleman in a blue shirt, unfortunately smack dab in the middle.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You are?
Oh, my name is Michael Yehuda.
Thank you.
I'm originally from the London School of Economics, but now I'm at GW here in Washington. I wonder, Professor Jervis, if you're familiar with the theory of great power autism. Because I think in addition to looking at individual decision-making and what leads to it and so on, I think, and perhaps culture, I think the historical experiences of countries is also very much affected by size. It's very much affected by size. Oh. So that a small country, for example, has to pay a lot of attention to its neighbors and whatever they may be doing, what pressures they may be bringing to bear. Whereas the United States, especially with the two oceans and only Mexico and Canada, obviously looks at the world from a very different sort of way. And it doesn't really matter a great deal what their specific political views may be. That nevertheless informs their judgment. I wonder what you think of that theory.
Yes, I think two aspects. One you hinted at, didn't quite let me just mention. I've talked about in beliefs on the individual level, and so it's a question, well, how do we aggregate up from individuals? And that, in a way, it's easier when we have what you consider called tribes because everyone thinks the same way. When there are differences, it's interesting. We follow this through the both social processes and even more through the decision-making process in governments. Yes, some countries are more insulated in a variety of senses of the term insulation. And I agree the United States is infamously insulated, if not isolated. The percentage of people either in the general public or in the elite or the government who speak a language other than English is, I don't know the number, but low, and I cannot speak a foreign language. I'm sure lower, I haven't seen the statistics, but I'm sure lower than probably almost any other country, maybe New Zealand or some other island, but you know, it's very low, much lower than the countries on the continent of Europe. And the number of American leaders or even members of who I think have traveled extensively is lower. I think it's also relatively low, I know, in Great Britain as compared to France or Germany or Italy. Russia would be interesting. I have no idea. I assume that's low. So I think it would be very interesting to look more systematically at that difference across countries and see if we can then see an impact on that, on the foreign policy, on the understanding of the world, on the degree of empathy involved. One reason, say, our bad misunderstanding of Japan and the Japanese terrible misunderstanding of the U.S. They thought we'd fight a limited war, which they could win, which they could, but we were not going to fight a limited war, and see how much of this we can attribute to the fact that the leaders and even the elites and even the foreign policy bureaucracies are much more parochial in some countries than others.
Thank you. We have a hand right here. Thanks.
Good evening. My name is Julian Kyle Lewis from the American University here in Washington. Professor, in all of your years of teaching, what was significant or unique about the most remarkable student that you can remember having in any of your classes? Thank you.
Well, one of the pleasures of teaching is the large number of students who've both gone on to do exceptionally fine scholarship, often disagreeing with me. And that's one of the real gratifications of this, having students who are independent-minded and being willing, and I think I'm happy to work with people who have very different and even conflicting ideas. I don't want to mention, I couldn't mention all of them by name, but there's always one or two a year. The other thing I mentioned is very, very gratifying. I teach the large introductory international politics course. Enrollment varies between 100 and 200. And there are always some number of students who come in not terribly interested, but who want to, who really, from the readings and the lectures, say, oh, this really is interesting. And maybe I'm not going to major in it, maybe I am, but I'm really going to, continue this. I once had a student who was the son of a significant figure in New York state politics. And after the class, he said, I was very cynical and really fed up with politics from seeing what it did to my father and his life. And, I really now understand a lot about why it's important and the parts that are honorable and exciting and worthwhile. And I found that very gratifying. Finally, story that will mean something to one person in the audience, that I have, for years I taught a graduate theories of international politics course. And very much sort of what's the graduate literature. And I had 3 undergraduates there to take it. And others then later asked me, could they take it? And I said, well, let me tell you, I've had 3 undergraduates take the course. One is a full professor at Harvard. The other went on to be an ambassador. And the third flunked. So you want to take the course. But no, part of it, making up for all the aggravation of the administration or the students.
Thanks. How about let's start up here in the front, and then we can work our way back.
Hi, Nicholas Romero. I'm here to represent myself. My question is regarding the multifaceted analysis with the multiple columns as a proposal for potential intelligence analysis production. But and that might work in the field of history, but for intelligence to have value, it needs, I believe, to be actionable by government officials. And if you have this complex, multifaceted analysis, I mean, what sort of assumption is built into a product like that it can actually lead to executable behavior from government bureaucracies or political leaders? Because it could devolve into a situation where you're sort of admiring the problem rather than producing something that simple-minded folk can actually execute when the time comes to actually use the product. So, I mean, how do you foresee, a proposed product like that being used?
Well, see, I think there are 3 aspects that you could do, and in general, it would help with people who are in or were in the IC. It would. I know people in what used to be called the Directorate of Directorate of Intelligence, DI, now DA, Director. They pride themselves on writing well. They don't. They write with bullet points for reasons partly for overreaction to 9/11 and the Iraq estimate. They misdiagnose the problem, and so every sentence has to be backed up by evidence, and it's a disastrous art form and terrible to read. So it would help if they started writing in full paragraphs and with reasoning involved. But more specifically, I think there are 3 things one can, in principle, do with analysis. One, and they do this some, and the PDB, I know, had this, President's Daily Brief, had it for Obama. I doubt if they have it for Trump because, he wants, is it charts and pictures? He receives information differently. But if you get a leader who likes to read, you can have backup. You say, okay, here's one paragraph thing. Now, if you want, this is oversimplified, you want the complexity, hit this button and I'll give you 3 things or 4 evidence. If you don't, skip it. But here it is if you want it. And also for the analyst or the analytic community to write those is very helpful in writing rather than just do the concluding paragraph first, because it can lead you to think, maybe I want to change some of that. That's one thing. A second, I think the intelligence can do more they call opportunity analysis. And many, although not all decision makers, have pushed for that. And generally the IC, as far as I've seen, resists. I should say, I know more about the IC than almost any other scholar, which means I know this much, because it's a very closed world. And I've called in when they screw up, and I've done a few other things, but knowledge is thin, and I could be wrong on this. My sense is they resist doing that because they feel too close to being political and policy. But I think they could do more. From what I see, here's a way to, either in an adversarial way or in a cooperative way, an opportunity there that I can see because I'm reading a lot of their message traffic that you in the White House can't see. Andy Marshall, who just died, many of you knew or knew of, famous figure, director of Office of Net Assessment in the Pentagon, was keen on this in the adversarial relation, which is certainly legitimate doing that. So I think you can do more of that. And though the third, I want to say, this is not, the paper I was describing isn't only, 2 things. It can be just intelligence. And sometimes, at least in the old days, again, we know because we have the declassified documents from the 50s and 60s and 70s, sometimes decision makers say, if we do we're thinking of doing A, B, or C, tell us how you think the other side is going to react to these. This is tricky because the intelligence then can get very close to policy, right? If you say, well, they're going to blow up the world if you do A, they're going to do something other awful if you do C, but if you do B, it'll be great, right? You're dictating policy. So it's tricky, but a number of times policymakers have asked. Some of these analyses are really quite good. My sense, I could be wrong, my sense is they did it more in the 50s and maybe 60s than they do it now, but I don't know. But my proposal for the paper is a joint policy IC. Policy people say, okay, we're pretty surely we want to do A or A and B. And then the intel people can say, okay, this is our best guess about how the other side's going to perceive it and how it's going to react. And then the third column might be sort of, and the IC does that alone without the third column. So, well, what could we look for that would indicate whether this is right or wrong, whether policy's working, whether we understand those things. So it's a joint, but there, especially after the Iraq fiasco, we've rebuilt a lot of the connections in the IC and the policy world. They got strained again under Trump, but it's difficult to get the cooperation without getting claims or actuality of politicization. But I think what I'm describing here actually, is doable. I don't think it's easy intellectually, but I think it's quite possible. You take top people would have to demand it and get people to do the art for them. But there are a lot of academic ideas that are really great but couldn't be done. I really think this, in principle, could be done if people at the top wanted it done and, kept at it. It wouldn't work for the first several iterations. You'd have to be willing to stick with it. But I think, it actually could be help. And I know people in the government who've made similar arguments, and with their greater experience, I think that would be feasible.
Thank you. How about right here in the second row?
Malcolm Odell started out as a historian, ended up as a sociologist, international development. And I'm looking at all the books you've written, all the articles, and how many things you've pointed out where we got it all wrong and how often we've gotten it wrong. And it just brings me back to a question that I have, that maybe the only thing we really learn from history is that we never learn from history.
Yeah, there's certainly something to that. I think it was Gates who said that when you were trying to, in the Defense Department, do defense planning, that the last, 3-4 wars, or at least military operations, had been one that had been totally unpredicted in any planning document, and you got it wrong. I think there's a tremendous tension, both psychological, and bureaucratic, and just saying how you should do it in between knowing that it's a highly uncertain world. But the other side can change. I mean, when you think of your predictions, if we'd had a bug in the office in which Mao Zedong and the equivalent, I don't know, of the Politburo met in the fall of 1950, we would have known that the Chinese were not going to enter the Korean War, because they decided in one night, they were not going to intervene. 2 days, less than that, 36 hours later, Mao changed his mind. Right? Really frustrating. So, on the one hand, I think we, both citizens and the government, need to understand you're often going to be wrong and you need the flexibility, but you need the confidence to act at the same time. I think that's a terrible burden, a terrible political burden for people, a terrible psychological burden. So in the post-mortem, I've done 2 fairly thorough post-mortems, the Iranian Revolution, and then the Iraq WMD failure. I've done some other ones that are still classified that I wasn't able to do in as much depth, and I've done a couple of other, again, studies that are still classified. And I've never felt the people were foolish or totally badly motivated. And I got attacked on the Iraq case because I say, no, you can't blame political pressure for the failure of the WMD analysis. The analysts were not unduly pressured because they believed it. And I've been, people have said I've sold out to Bush. Anyway, so I think for those of us on the outside, and partly it's back to your question, I think we have to have an appreciation of the terrible difficulties these people labor under, and the fact that it's easy when you don't have responsibility to see the unpredictability and the trade-offs. Tom Fingar, who was the head of the National Intelligence Council, has a fairly good book with a terrible title. The title, I've got it, is some reducing uncertainty or something like that. No, that isn't the job of intelligence. It's to do the best you can to convey the degree of uncertainty that you have in the evidence that we have in front of us. Often the best analysis has to tell the decision maker, life is tough, boss, but I got to tell you, it's more uncertain than you think. Now, in the end, you've got to choose. But my job is to bring these uncertainties forward and tell you why people reach this conclusion. Not only some people think this, some people think that. But why do they? So what is your judgment maybe going to rest on? And that's a difficult conversation, but that's how I think, again, in principle, one can manage it. But I quite agree that it's extraordinarily difficult, and I know I try to not keep tabs, but I try to predict what's going to happen, say, in Iran or North Korea, and I look at all the cases I've been wrong and then try to say, well, why was I wrong and what can I do with that? But yes, the understanding that in a lot of cases you're going to be wrong I think it's very hard, both for the intelligence and even more for the decision maker. I think we know some individuals cope with uncertainty better than others. And I think some decision makers can bear that burden better than others. And then what would be interesting to see is people with those personality characteristics, in some sense objectively, do they do a better job over time? My hunch would be yes, but only a hunch.
Let's go back to this side here. How about 3 in? And then we'll go one next.
I got a two-part question that might bring out.
If you could use the microphone a little bit closer.
I have a two-part question that might bring out some of what you've said about perceptions. Russia and President Putin is a major focus of policymakers and the public. I was reading a book recently, a diplomatic memoir, where the
A little louder.
a diplomatic memoir where the author is saying that, well, Putin had all these conspiracy theories about the United States. He thought we were behind the Orange Revolution, the Rose Revolution. And he saw the way the United States was behaving as a threat, therefore, to his country. The person who was writing this memoir never kind of tried, was the ambassador, actually, to Russia, and never tried to correct, at least in his memoir, go to Putin and say, no, this is the reason your belief is wrong. Is there a way, when you have someone who is saying something, a policymaker of another country, to correct that misperception, or what's the best way? And the second part of the question deals with our perceptions of Putin. Because, there's a sort of issue around about, well, what is motivating him? Is he just trying to overthrow all the democracies in the world? Or is he perhaps, reacting to some of these bad things he believes about the United States, and including some real pressures the United States has put on him, his lack of cooperation in, say, Libya, which he felt could be a source of terrorism. So I'm wondering, from that side of the question, where it's not a question of correcting a misperception, how should people in the intelligence community, how should policymakers determine what is Putin's motivation? How should they arrive at a correct perception of that? What can they take? My name is Steve Weissman.
Yeah. Very hard and very important, and I can't do the question justice, especially in the time we have, but let me take, it's extremely difficult. I mean, we debate this very question. My sense, not being a Russian expert, is that Putin certainly does think that we had a very large role in the color revolutions, that we have been and are trying to undermine him. And of course, he sees or saw the efforts in the Obama administration to encourage democracy in Russia as aimed at and having the effect of undermining him. It probably did have the effect. I'm not sure that was the aim. Others say, don't be taken in. He's saying that and he wants us to believe that because then we'll be more conciliatory toward him. So in this case and in many others, both contemporary and in the past, your perception of the other side's motives is very linked to policy preference. If you think the other side is operating out of fear of you, you're likely to be more conciliatory. So if the other side knows that, he wants you to think that his actions are not motivated by aggression, but motivated by fear. And this is what my colleague Karen Yari-Milo in her book, Knowing the Enemy, talks about the reasons for different perceptions of adversaries, both in the 1930s and then later for the Reagan administration and the Carter and the Reagan administrations. If the other side has these incorrect, can you correct them? It certainly is very hard. And I think there's never a simple and magic solution. The hope is that with good, empathetic, steady diplomacy over time, if you have access to the top people and you have prolonged discussion, you can at least induce some doubt about, gee, maybe that isn't the right. You can do some, quote, education. During the end of the Cold War, Secretary of State Shultz said a lot of what he was doing, especially with Shevardnadze, was trying to educate him on various elements here, and he thinks it worked about the war. During the start of the SALT negotiations, the American team for the first year spent a lot of time trying to educate, and I want to put air quotes around it, the Soviets on correct nuclear strategy and mutual assured destruction, and et cetera. The Soviets weren't buying it. Turns out the Pentagon wasn't buying it either. But, there was a degree of meeting of the minds. And I talked about a related thing with Jack Matlock, who was both the NSC person under Reagan and before that, I think, or after, forgotten which, was ambassador to Moscow. And he said he thought his main job, and he thinks, not he himself, but the whole U.S. government was able to do that quite well, both to understand Gorbachev, to reduce the Rashomon effect on both sides. And he sees this as a great triumph. I don't mean that critically. I mean, we often ridicule the triumphalism, but he has a good argument that this was excellent diplomacy on both sides that did that. And relatedly, the standard story, I'm not sure if it's true, but the standard, Christian, others may know, for Ronald Reagan is that Gorderevsky, the Soviet spy, and our analysis of Soviet fears in the Able Archer military exercise, and I think the conventional story on that is wrong, but let me put that aside, that Reagan came to understand in 1983 and 84 that the Soviets were genuinely afraid that the U.S. would launch a preventive strike. And he says, I think in the diary, he sort of couldn't believe that. How could anyone think that about it? But he came to be convinced that they really did think that, even though they were wrong, and that was very important because it meant a lot of his job had to be reducing their fear. And again, Matlock said that was one of his main jobs. So I think there are cases when it can be done better, but there's a degree of receptiveness. Interesting. Gorbachev was very receptive to believing that the U.S., you could make a deal with the U.S. In fact, he couldn't make a deal with the U.S. Luckily, he misperceived us and worked out very well, at least for the medium run. And Reagan, who seemed to many of us to have a very rigid worldview, in fact, we've now, by scholars who've looked at what Reagan believed when he came in the White House, was actually susceptible to believing the Soviet Union could change. So it may be a combination of skillful diplomacy and pre-existing receptivity.
Okay, good. Right here in the middle.
David Nichols at the Department of State. I'm wondering how useful you find personality disorders for analyzing international politics, and particularly narcissistic personality disorder.
Yes. That it's interesting. I don't have but in the 1930s, the dominant worldview of social science really is built on economics. I think that's unfortunate, but a statement I think is still true. In the 1930s and 40s, it was really built on Freud and various forms of psychoanalysis. And that gone out of style, and psychoanalysis, in the broadest sense, has migrated to the humanities, and I think perhaps to the detriment of both the humanities and the social sciences. It's hard because, of course, it isn't a science. There are lots of problems, although recent science has confirmed some basic things of Freudianism in the broadest sense. That is, that most of our processing is unconscious, that this does have great influence on us, things of that sort. That there were some attempts to really discredit the idea of personality. My late colleague at Columbia, Walter Mischel, was one who did some very interesting work along those lines. But I think in the end, yes, there is a lot to that. And the difficulties are at least twofold. One is that you want to be careful because so many of these, if you will, diagnoses also bring with them stigmas and negative judgments. And, some narcissistic personalities can be extraordinarily successful in certain circumstances. So we don't want to we want to separate the insult from the, if you will, the diagnosis, and that's hard. The evidence is difficult, and we want to be quite fair-minded about it. But I think it is important, and for years the CIA did personality profiles. The person who did them then left, went to, was it GW? One of the, Jerry Post, he's published a lot of books. He said he's gotten a lot of cases right. Some of those I saw at the time I didn't think he got right, but anyway, I'll leave that aside. But some of them were found very helpful. The ones he says in the book, and this I believe is correct, the ones he did in preparation for the Camp David summit were very useful. So, and decision makers here are quite receptive when they're going to meet the other leaders for the first time. They really want to know things about them. After they met the other people, I think once or twice, I'm not sure. They may feel, I already understand them, don't tell me. But I think it is valuable, and I think it is definitely worth doing. And I think, again, it best done by a general diagnosis and then trying to pin down and say, well, I think in these circumstances, this is what we're going to see. I think you want to make it predictive, not so that you can then self-correct, or you can give the decision maker red flags for where the decision maker can come back to you and tell you, hey, buddy, it doesn't look like this was right. So I think it is useful, and I think we've overcorrected, we in the academic community, on this.
Unfortunately, I have to draw this to a close. However, in 4 days, on Monday the 8th, you can return. This time it'll be around the seminar table for Jennifer Miller, who will be presenting on her new book, Cold War Democracy, the United States and Japan. I want to thank you for all turning out on this beautiful day, and I want to thank Robert Jervis for this great conversation.
Oh, thank you.